When thus he had spoken, the hot sun was setting. The streets of Laredo grew cold as the clay. We took the young cowboy down to the green valley. And there stands his marker we made to this day. We beat the drum slowly, played the fife lowly, played the dead march as we carried him along. Down in the green valley, lay the sod o'er him. He was a young cowboy. As I walked out on the streets of Laredo, as I walked out on Laredo one day, I spied a poor cowboy wrapped in white linen, wrapped in white linen as cold as the clay. I can see by your outfit that you are a cowboy. These words he did say as I boldly walked by. Come and sit down beside me and hear my sad story. Shot in the breast and I know I must die. It was once in the saddle I used to go dashing. Once in the saddle I used to go gay. First to the card house and then down to Roses. But I'm shot in the breast and I'm dying today. It's 6 jolly cowboys to carry my coffin, 6 dance hall maidens to bear up my pall, throw bunches of roses all over my coffin, roses to deaden the clods as they fall. Then beat the drum slowly, play the fife lowly, play the dead march as you carry me along. Take me to the green valley, lay the sod o'er me. I'm a young cowboy and I know I've done wrong. Then go write a letter to my gray-haired mother and tell her the cowboy that she loved has gone. But please not one word of the man who has killed me. Don't mention his name and his name will pass on. When thus he had spoken, the hot sun was setting. The streets of Laredo grew cold as the clay. We took the young cowboy down to the green valley. And there stands his marker we made to this day.
Hello, everyone. My name is Norma Elia Cantu. I'm the president of the American Folklore Society. I'm also the Murchison Professor in the Humanities at Trinity University in San Antonio. And with that, I want to acknowledge all the spirits of this place that is Yanaguana, the home of the Coahuiltecan groups of Native people of the area. And I also want and ask each one of you to also acknowledge and recognize our ancestors from wherever we are joining. Buenas tardes, good afternoon, good morning, buenos dias, and on, because we are all over the globe. It is a pleasure and an honor to moderate this session, the second webinar sponsored by the Fellows of the American Folklore Society. We have an exciting program today, and we will be recording it. We ask that, of course, you mute and ask also that you put questions in the Q&A. And if you would like, you can also make comments. Tell us where you're signing in from on the chat. Y con eso, with that, I go on to our first speaker. José E. Limón is the Notre Dame Foundation Professor of American Literature Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame and the Modi C. Boatwright Regents Professor of American Literature Emeritus at the University of Texas at Austin. Born in Texas, José earned his BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, and he has received countless honors, including the American Folklore Society's Américo Paredes Prize for Distinguished Folklore Scholarship. He also received the Lifetime Distinguished Scholarly Achievement Award from the Western Literature Association.
I think so. I don't know what you were getting at.
Among his most significant publications are the books Mexican Ballads, Chicano Poems, History and Influence in Mexican American Social Poetry, which received an honorable mention award for the University of Chicago Folklore Prize for a distinguished contribution to folklore scholarship. His book, Dancing with the Devil, Society and Cultural Poetics in Mexican American South Texas, was named the winner of the 1996 American Ethnological Society Senior Scholar Prize for, quote, a vital and contentious contribution to ethnology. Jose is a good friend and a fellow scholar, and at present, actually, he is retired in Long Beach, California, and working on a book on the streets of Laredo, Maternity and its Discontents. And with that, I give you Jose. Each of the speakers will speak for about 8 minutes, and I will introduce each one and then go on for a discussion among ourselves and then a discussion with all of you who are in attendance through the Q&A function or comments through the chat. Gracias. Jose, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Norma. And good morning, everyone. At least it's still morning out here in California. Let me begin. I am not given to abstract theorizing about such concepts as the other, although going into the 21st century, I am beginning to have some doubts about its usefulness, especially within the broad ambit of Western societies and cultures. Even in the 20th century, it was already a fluid construct that perhaps I can illustrate with my own life and career. During the course of my career as an anthropological folklorist, most of my work focused on what Américo Paredes famously called Greater Mexico. I was born and reared as a Mexican American in that regional part of Greater Mexico called Southern Texas. And following Paredes' own example, I decided to focus my work on that region, for which the culmination was indeed the book that Norma mentioned, Dancing with the Devil, Society and Cultural Poetics in Mexican American South Texas. So one might possibly have the supposition that I was not an other to that Mexican American regional other. Yet in the second part of that book, I made at least an implicit argument that I had experienced a certain kind of otherness even within that native world, supposedly my own. For I had long been largely absent from South Texas, largely by virtue of higher education, but also a geographical distancing at the University of Texas in Austin. Austin, Texas, and the University of Texas was definitely not Mexican-American Southern Texas, culturally speaking, at least not in the 1960s and 70s. And of course, I remained, as some of you know, I remained largely there in Austin after my undergraduate education all the way through the PhD. This elongated education in Austin also had another interesting effect on my question of otherness. It really became, you see, for the first time that I came to really know what we refer to as Anglos. You see, the South Texas of that time was really still a zone of racial segregation for Mexican Americans, with interesting exceptions, such as Norma Cantu's predominantly Mexican American Laredo, Texas. I myself was born and mostly reared in Laredo. And to be sure, there were some Anglos in Laredo, but we didn't think of them as real Anglos. I will come back to Laredo in a moment. The real Anglos for us began just 20 miles outside Laredo and into the rest of Texas, except along portions of the Rio Grande. Most unfortunately, to this day, I think it's most unfortunately, my family had to move to Corpus Christi in my impressionable teenage years, where the city was then majority Anglo. We called them Anglos when we were being polite. Most of the time, we weren't. And we and they resorted to what Américo Paredes referred to in an article as gringo, greaser, and other neighborly names. Later, the title of a collection of essays in his honor, edited by Richard Bauman, to which John and I both contributed. Over time, I came to feel much more comfortable with what had been my most significant other back in Texas, South Texas. But this, by the way, was not so much a result of higher education in general, but rather a higher education in the humanities and social sciences, a different kind of Anglo culture, if you will, augmented by my participation in the left-wing politics of that time in the group called Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, where I also, for the first time, became acquainted with that very particular other, the Texas Jewish Anglo. But that other Texas Anglo, the non-humanities, non-left-wing, non-Jewish Texas Anglo, was also at UT, most explicitly represented by the fraternities, but also by certain merchants, such as barbers, for example, around the university who preferred not to serve Mexicans. The Anglo was still out there and down there in South Texas, and I became even more acutely conscious of his and her presence whenever I went home to visit. And oddly enough, perhaps even more so after I became a student of folklore with Américo Paredes and read books like With His Pistol in His Hand for the first time. Yet, if you read my early ethnographic work closely, such as part 2 of Dancing with the Devil, as I know some of you have done, I really say very little about that most significant Anglo other. Rather, I concentrated on describing and analyzing the Mexican-American expressive world, understanding, however, that this cultural expression is always socially conditioned by the dominant other of that moment. Although that dominant other was not explicitly present in Dancing with the Devil, as it was, for example, in With His Pistol in His Hand. However, part 1 of that book critically reviews my predecessors who worked among Mexican Americans in South Texas, and therefore, in a certain sense, it does take up the Anglo other, at least historically, and does so in 2 chapters that some of you might recall. One on John Gregory Burke, who did field work among Mexican Americans in South Texas in the late 19th century, and another chapter on the famous J. Frank Dobie, who also worked among Mexican Americans in South Texas in the 1920s and 30s. Some Mexican American intellectuals, including Américo Paredes, attacked these 2 men as unredeemable racists and imperialists. But always being something of a contrarian in my life, I deployed a more psychoanalytical approach, if you will, to get at the more nuanced contradictions in the psyches of these 2 early folklores, to get at their fissured and fractured otherness, if you will. For a number of good and bad reasons, my career then moved in a more literary and cultural studies direction, in which I have also continued with my perhaps now morbid fascination with the complications of Anglo otherness in Texas. I published analyses, for example, on the Texas writings of Catherine Ann Porter and Cormac McCarthy, but also Nelson Algren, the great Chicago writer who spent time in South Texas. I am continuing this kind of work in 2 books and volumes, both of which, by the way, do not overlook Mexican Americans. One is called Neither Friends Nor Strangers, Anglos and Mexicans in the Literary Making of Texas. But the second is far more pertinent to folklorists and is called, as Norma noted, The Streets of Laredo, Modernity and Its Discontents, which is why I think Amy and Jessica wanted to play the opening song, in case any of you were wondering why we opened with that song in a session on Latinidades. The song deals, of course, with what the great folklorist Wayland Hand of UCLA called, quote, the most famous 19th century cowboy ballad. The Streets of Laredo, also known as the Cowboy's Lament, had its ancestry, of course, in the 18th century Anglo-Irish ballads, The Unfortunate Lad and The Bad Girl's Lament. And we have reason to believe that both of these Irish ballads made their way to Texas, where they were then transformed. Thus, you see, this project, now in my retirement, has also taken me to that most other of Texas Anglo others, the 19th century white Texas cowboy, who composed and sang this song on the great cattle drives from South Texas to Kansas, to voice, I argue, a kind of cowboy ethic and to express his discontent with an encroaching capitalist modernity in Texas, or so I argue. The rest of the book then tries to show how that discontent with modernity was then carried over into a great number of other 20th and 21st century cultural texts, such as, for example, the recent Coen brothers film, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. Obviously, however, by its very name, this project has also taken me back to my ancestral Laredo, which is to say, to Mexican America, but only, I have discovered, to come up with the oddest paradox concerning the other. After some considerable research and reflection, I have arrived at the view that this very Anglophone song, called indeed The Streets of Laredo, and the events that it represents, in all probability, did not take place in the 19th century Laredo, Texas, that we have come to know historically. For in that time, Laredo, as a predominantly Mexican-American city, along with other factors, may have been much too much other for white Anglo-Texan cowboys. In our time, however, a Mexican-American from South Texas, which is to say, someone, has now fully taken up this song in my scholarship. And so my history in some odd way has come roundabout to my most significant other, perhaps no longer that significantly other. And I now have come to think of, within my scholarship, I have come to think of the song, The Streets of Laredo, as my own song. Y'all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. You always make me smile with your wit. It's so subtle. Raquel Romberg earned her PhD in folklore from the University of Pennsylvania and works as an independent scholar. She's a sociocultural anthropologist and a folklorist specializing in magic and modernity in the Caribbean. Dr. Romberg is the author of Witchcraft and Welfare, Spiritual Capital and the Business of Magic in Modern Puerto Rico, Healing Dramas, Divination, and Magic in Puerto Rico. And of course, several articles on modernity, the modernity of magic and ritual healing, the drama and poetics of divination, discourses and corporeality of spirit possession, the ethnohistory of spiritism and brujeria, and creolization as a cultural process in colonial and post-colonial contexts. Her research and teaching combine folklore, anthropology, and ethnohistory in the exploration of intersections between history, culture, and power, global and local culture, and material culture, affect, and the senses. Dr. Romberg was associate editor of the journal Magic, Ritual, and Witchcraft and taught anthropology and folklore at undergraduate and graduate levels at Temple University, Swarthmore College, the Hebrew University, and Tel Aviv University. Since 2010, she is engaged in a new research and publishing project at the Minerva Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of the End of Life, Tel Aviv University. Raquel, I am so happy you were able to join us today. Please
Thank you.
Gift
Thank
us
you
with
so
your
much.
presentation.
Gracias for the introduction. And I would like to say hello to everyone here from Tel Aviv. I'm really excited about being here, and I thank Amy for inviting me to participate. Initially, I thought about sharing my ethnographic reflections on the various dialogical positionalities of othering that emerged during my fieldwork with Aide, a Puerto Rican bruja espiritista. But then I realized that what really interested me was to problematize the dialogical aspects of the other and of othering processes, while keeping the postcolonial conception of the other in place, that is, differences, consideration of differences becoming discriminatory. I want to contend with the often dualistic and static preconceptions we all have about the other, and also about the unidirectional assumptions about processes of othering. Drawing on a few visual vignettes, I want to consider instead the indeterminate generative power of othering as it emerged in my ethnographic ethnohistorical study of brujeria. I will illustrate my point through 5 moments that vividly convey, in my opinion, a series of dialogical points of contention between different kinds of others and othering processes that all resulted actually in irreverent and powerful forms of incorporation that transformed discrimination into magical empowerment and spiritual capital. I will now turn to share screen. Wait a second, where is the... Okay, you can all see? You can see the slide? Okay. Right at the beginning of my apprenticeship with Aide, this image caught my attention. It's a trabajo here, packaged. It's a trabajo, a magic work prepared by Aide for one of her clients, and then left hanging on a cross for the purpose of empowering it for 7 days. Empowering it with a cross, okay? This odd merging into the convoluted history of Catholicism with magic became clearer to me as I delved into the history, the ethnohistory of Spanish colonialism and brujeria in Puerto Rico, which was very similar to other parts of Latin America and the Spanish Caribbean. Domination and discrimination from the Spanish colonial side and the recognition of the symbols of powerful others from the side of brujos, rather than submission to them, created the conditions for the illicit ritual empowerment or incorporation of symbols of powerful others in order to channel them in ways that were foreign to those who imposed them in the first place. This is what I term ritual piracy or creolization with an attitude. The second moment I want to reflect on is on Espiritismo, the belief in the communication with spirits as it was encoded by the French Allan Kardec in the 19th century as scientific spiritism. It arrived to the island around 1860 and immediately was adopted by anti-clerical progressive criollos fighting for independence against Spain. Of course, Spiritism immediately began to be Spiritism, and Spiritists, of course, were persecuted by the Spanish colony for its potential revolutionary force. But paradoxically, about 100 years later, Espiritistas such as Aide were persecuted and delegitimized by the followers of Espiritismo Científico because they allegedly Africanized and folklorized the pure, authentic Espiritismo Científico. Here we can see ethnic and racial othering processes within Espiritismo, delegitimating a group of what they called popular Espiritistas. But then there's another point, another twist to this story, when the ELA, El Estado Libre Asociado, or Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, was established, and with it the medical state apparatus, following the Americanization of the island, the state began persecuting Espiritistas, all of them, regardless, for being charlatans, that is, as remnants, as I would say, out of time remnants of the Spanish colonial era, who kept on propagating what they thought as superstitions against the rationality of the medical system. Now, brujos who were persecuted by the state roughly until the 1980s. I can later explain why the 1980s brujos began acting as brokers between the state and their clients, intervening in cases of bureaucratic food dragging, for example, and in the negotiations for the recognition of welfare rights. Often at the center of influential others, social circles, brujos extended their area of influence, helping their clients both with spiritual and practical advice, such as recommending them with powerful lawyers who were also clients, or also agents in labor and housing agencies within the state. Uh, it, the name of my first book, Witchcraft and Welfare, reflects on these kinds of interventions of brujos. Unexpected, I would say. Um, here, on, oops, wait, okay, oh, this is it. On Halloween, I saw Aide transform into an Anglo witch, here with the bonneted black hat, who offered corn candy to her clients during the day. And then at night, when she conducted a fiesta espiritual, I saw her transform into a Puerto Rican bruja, but who was proud to be part of the lineage of both Anglo-Spanish Puerto Rican brujos through the years, who were persecuted, were killed, and which, according, in her own views, both of Anglos and Spanish brujos survived the annihilation that were supposed to terminate their work. I'm proud to be a bruja, she used to say to me. I'm the bruja número uno. And so she really carried with a lot of pride the fact that she was part of that lineage of brujos, Anglos and Spanish brujos. The next moment I want to comment on, this is one of the first pictures I took of Aide speaking on her phone in 1995 and being possessed while her beeper was hanging from her dress. In 1995, I didn't even dream of owning a cell phone or a beeper, but she had it. These technologies of communication, and later you will see also mass production, traditionally seen as the enemies of folklore, served instead to extend and enhance the reach and spiritual power of brujos. Commodification, here you can see, rather than threaten the authenticity of brujeria, as many might assume, even I, when I arrived, this was kind of surprising to me to see, provides a market of new powerful entities, transnational entities, not nationalist, by the way, that could be recruited in enhancing their spiritual capital. Here you can see Aide performing a trabajo, a spiritual wedding that takes into account a pepper-rich farm, 3-layer coconut cake filled with with the bride and groom, and with all sorts of different elements to enhance their union, and which she then placed within the original box in front of the Buddha for empowering it, now with the Buddha. I will stop share now just to say a few words in summing up, that rather than to stress how difference becomes discriminatory, my intention here was to look at how discriminatory differences were played out dialogically at different points of history, and show how various forms of discrimination were transformed in unexpected, indeterminate, embodied forms of empowerment, in this case through the technologies of magic. What begins as exclusion may be dialogically transformed into incorporation, with a twist, of course, in generating new forms of folklore.
We're not hearing.
This is it. I used up my 10 minutes, exactly. So I will answer afterwards some questions if you have.
Thank you, Raquel. And I'm sure we will have some questions and some conversation afterwards. And I knew it was going to happen, that I would not unmute. So our next speaker is Ruth Becha, who was born in Havana, Cuba, grew up in New York. She is the Victor Jaime Ferreira Collegiate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. As a cultural anthropologist, poet, writer for young people, teacher, and public speaker, Ruth is known for the compassion she brings to her quest to understand the depth of the human experience. She has lived in Spain and Mexico and returns often to Cuba to build bridges around culture, literature, and Jewish life. In her career, Behar as a cultural anthropologist, Behar has written several books, most notably Translated Woman, The Vulnerable Observer, another one, An Island Called Home, and Traveling Heavy, and is also the author of a bilingual book of poetry, Everything I Kept, Todo lo que guardé. More recently, Behar has begun writing books for young people, and she won the Pura Belpre Author Medal for her debut middle grade novel, Lucky Broken Girl. Her new middle grade novel is Letters from Cuba, a Sidney Taylor notable book, and is based on her grandmother's escape from Poland to start a new life in Cuba on the eve of World War II. Her debut picture book, Tia Fortuna's New Home, is forthcoming in 2022. Ruth was the first Latina to win a MacArthur Genius Grant and has been named a Great Immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. She has been recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's also a Macondista, a fellow, what would I call it, luchadora for literature and for all things folklore. So, Ruth, muchas gracias for being here, and you're on.
Gracias, Norma. I really appreciate your introduction and your beautiful words. It's so nice to be here. I'm so glad to be included in this really exciting conversation with so many people I admire and respect. So thank you so much for having me. Let me just start with a little personal note, and then I'll talk about as much as I can in 8 to 10 minutes. I wanted to say, José, as you were speaking about Anglos, I was thinking about how with my parents, who are still alive in their mid to late 80s, to this day, as Cubans who came in the 60s to the United States and to New York and still live in New York, they constantly talk about themselves and then los Americanos. There's always this other group, los Americanos, and I always say to them, but you're Americanos too. You've been here a long time. And so, bueno, los Americanos. So that distinction, curiously, still exists with them as well. And for me, this notion of otherness it has been a relevant notion, I think, always, in part because of my identity as a Latina and a Jew, and growing up with that combination, which did not seem at all strange to me when I was a kid in New York. It was when I went off to college that people just seemed to find that to be a very strange mix of identities. And so there was certainly some otherness there that I think may have had something to do with my interest in eventually in studying anthropology and understanding identities and mixtures of identities and so on. But once I went into anthropology, there was another otherness that we don't often talk about, which is the otherness I felt as a writer and the kind of writer I wanted to be, and feeling at first that I wasn't sure how I was going to write the way I wanted to in anthropology, and really struggling with expectations about how we were supposed to write, how we were supposed to share knowledge, and so on. So it was an identity thing, but it was also a writing thing. Like, what kind of writer was I going to be as an anthropologist? And so I'm going to focus today on the work I've done in Cuba over the last 30 years, but I do want to say that before working in Cuba, I worked in Spain and then in Mexico. And in Spain, it was interesting because my paternal side is Sephardic, and so working in Spain kind of meant going back to this place that had been a site of expulsion, 500 years earlier, or at least that was how I understood it. And so there was Spain, but Spain was such an important place for me as a Spanish speaker, always remembering that Spanish is my first language and that I went to Spain kind of where my mother tongue, arises from. And so that was very crucial. And then working in Mexico was very crucial because that was where I started to think about the border and what the border means and various kinds of otherness as well, because people would say to me in the town of Mesquitic where I worked, well, you can cross that border so easily, but we can't. And so it made me think a lot about also differences and distinctions within Latinidad identity and the kinds of privileges that I had been granted as a Cuban immigrant to the US. And so all of these issues were very important to me. And then particularly connecting with Chicana Latina writers in the late 80s and early 90s, many of them were trying to figure out their identity with a connection to Mexico. And they started saying to me, well, what about you in Cuba? Maybe you need to, figure out your connection to Cuba. And that led me on this journey to go back to Cuba, which I had done first in 1979 as a student. I had gone back briefly to Cuba, but then in 1991 I started traveling to Cuba on a regular basis, and really that became a major part of my life, to reconnect with the island and connect with Cubanos in the United States and elsewhere as well. And so that led to a bunch of kind of community-focused projects. I'll just kind of hold up the books so you can see them. So, there was Bridges to Cuba, where I was like connecting Cubans on the island with Cubans in the diaspora. And just even using the word diaspora in the early 90s was kind of a new thing to think about, that connection between these communities that had been divided by politics and revolution. Then the portable island came next, and then thinking about Cubanness as actually a kind of fluid identity and how portable that identity had become. So these two anthologies that I edited, and then most recently I want to share this book, Handmade in Cuba, which focuses on the work of a dear friend of mine, a Cuban artist and bookmaker with whom I've collaborated on various projects in Cuba, particularly poetry. And that became very important to me as I connected with Cuba. I found that I couldn't always do anthropology, but I could write poems about my experiences in Cuba. So all of that work that was kind of thinking about Cuba in terms of memory and art and poetry and anthropology and folklore, all of that, stories and testimonios as well, which of course I learned about through our Latina feminist collective that Norma and I are part of. So all of that was very, very important for me. And then I worked on this book, An Island Called Home, which is a book about the Jews of Cuba. And I went and did this study, traveling all over the island of Cuba, looking for all the Jewish people I could find and writing about them and my encounters with them, a community of about 1,000. So all of those projects were kind of nurturing me in various kinds of ways, intellectually and culturally and spiritually and artistically, and creating these communities, not going as an anthropologist to communities that already existed and studying them, but rather actively serving as a kind of instigator of communities, creating communities through books and through stories and various kinds of connections with people on the island and outside of the island. So that was all very important. And most recently, as Norma said, I've started writing fiction for kids, which was never anything I intended to do. And I wrote Lucky Broken Girl, over here, Lucky Broken Girl, and this was based on my own story. Soon after we arrived from Cuba to New York, we were in a very bad car accident, and I had to be in bed for a year in a body cast, recovering from a terrible leg injury. And so that's what that book is about, but has a lot of stories about Cuban identity and the Cuban community at that time in New York. But most recently, this is what I want to focus on in the amount of time I have. Letters from Cuba is this newest book that I've written. And this book really brings together folklore, history, ethnography, fiction, family history. It's a kind of ethno-fiction. I had never done anything like this before, so it was really like just jumping in and experimenting with this new form of writing. It is inspired by my maternal grandmother's story. My maternal grandmother was an immigrant from Poland, a Jewish immigrant from Poland, who was the first of all the offspring in the family to go to Cuba, meet up with her father in Cuba, and work to bring the whole family over to Cuba on the eve of World War II. And so I'd always heard that story. I always thought, wow, this is so amazing. She was so brave. How did she do this? But that was all I knew, so I didn't have enough ethnographic information or ethnohistorical information to tell the story. All I knew is that she had gone to Cuba first. Her father, my great grandfather, wanted to bring one of the sons first, and she said, no, even though I'm a girl, I'm going to help you bring everybody. I'm the oldest. I should be the first to go. And she convinced him, and she was the first to go to Cuba and helped him bring the whole family over. So that was all I knew, but there were so many gaps in the history. I didn't know what it was like to be a Jewish girl from Poland, arrive in Cuba and try a pineapple for the first time, or what it was like to hear Spanish. How did she learn Spanish? How did she go from Polish and Yiddish to speaking Spanish? How did she feel? How did her body feel in a tropical climate? There was all these things I didn't know. It had never occurred to me to ask her all these things. And so this is what led me to fiction. I said, I'm going to recreate my image of my grandmother as a slightly younger woman than she was in real life when she got to Cuba. I'm going to recreate this. And then the interesting thing is that my family, my maternal family, settled in a small town in the province of Matanzas called Agramonte. And they were the only Jewish family there. So I was always imagining these Jewish people from Poland landing, in the town of Agramonte, of all places. And I had always been curious about Agramonte. When I started traveling to Cuba, I would go and stop in Agramonte. So I'd been there a few times. And then, just a couple of years ago, I went to do some research for this novel and found so many interesting things about it. It turns out that Agramonte is a hub for Afro-Cuban culture, particularly Yoruba and Arara culture from West Africa. And there are other people who have been studying Agramonte for its folklore and music and dance. And I want to mention this book. This just came out. I wish it had come out before I wrote my novel, Situated Narratives and Sacred Dance. And it's so fascinating to me because there are whole chapters on Agramonte and a neighboring town called Perico. And so this is where my grandmother and her family settled. It was where my mother lived until she was 8 years old. And so I found out all these things about Agramonte. I found out about a sacred ceiba tree where offerings are left to the spirits of slaves who worked in the area, because it was an area that was filled with enslaved Africans who were brought to work in the sugar plantations there. And that was why it became such a hub for West African culture in Cuba. And so it was such an exciting thing for me to discover this and to figure out how was I going to connect a Polish Jewish girl named Esther, just like my grandmother, who arrives in Cuba. She goes to live in this town. She's really curious. She meets a girl who's Afro-Cuban named Manuela. They become friends. And then she meets a boy who is Chinese-Cuban, Francisco Chang, because there was also an important Chinese-Cuban community in Agramonte and in Cuba generally. So I needed to bring all of that in, which meant I needed to create characters, and I needed to figure out how they would all respond to one another. So it was really like jumping into completely new territory for me, creating fiction from this ethnographic research that I did. And in terms of otherness, that became an important topic for me because Esther in Poland was an other, and that's one of the reasons she had to leave Poland because of discrimination and anti-Semitism and so on. And so she goes to Cuba, where suddenly she's not an other because there's so many others who are other in Cuba, the Afro-Cubans, the Chinese-Cubans. So she's an other among others. And so there's this interesting intersectionality that takes place. And then there is one very anti-Semitic person in the town, the owner of the sugar plantation, who's anti-Semitic and xenophobic. And but she, together with her friends and the town, come together to fight against this one really rabid, horrible anti-Semite, Señor Eduardo, in the town, sort of to show young readers that it is possible to fight against hatred if people come together in communities as they do in Agramonte. And so Esther becomes so close to her friends and to this community that then by the end of the story, and I won't give everything away because I hope you'll read it, then by the end of the story, she has very divided loyalties because she's done something very unusual. Because it's just her and her father who are in this town by themselves, she's begged him first to let her invite her friends for Passover. So her Passover Seder is shared with these friends who are Afro-Cuban and Chinese Cuban. And then the same with Hanukkah. They share these Jewish holidays. Instead of making them separate holidays, they become holidays that are open to others. And so Esther also becomes in this way connected to the community of Cuba and starts to feel really a part of Cuba. Her loyalties are very divided by the end of the story. When the family, she and her father, are able to move to Havana, where there's already an established Jewish community, where she can go to a Jewish day school. And suddenly she's not sure she really wants to go and to be part of that community because she's become part of this Cuban community. And so she's torn between the two. And you'll have to read the book to see how it all works out in the end. But I discovered that there were limits to what I could do as an ethnographer, and that led me to writing this kind of ethnofiction. I also was thinking about the immigrant crisis on the border, kids in cages, xenophobia. I was thinking about all of those things as I was writing this book, and wanting to make a statement about immigration at an earlier era in the late 1930s with Jewish immigrants trying to get to Cuba, which is a very, very different story from what we normally think about when we think about immigration. We don't think of immigrants going to Cuba. We think of immigrants leaving Cuba. So I thought that that was very interesting. And I thought that the Jewish story also is not often told as a story of people migrating to Spanish-speaking Latin American countries. So those were some of my rationales also for telling the story. And there was definitely a lot of ethnographic and anthropological motivation behind this story, but I ended up telling it via fiction. So I'm sure I've gone over time, so I'm going to stop here. I wasn't able to check exactly when I started, so Nordma, I better stop. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. It's fine. We have plenty of time, and we'll have a last speaker, and then we will have a few minutes for exchange among ourselves. And there are some questions already coming in. So our next speaker is John Holmes McDowell, Professor Emeritus in the Indiana University Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, a department that John chaired on multiple occasions. He is a fellow of the American Folklore Society and recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, editor of the Journal of Folklore Research Reviews, and co-founder of DIRT, the Diverse Environmentalisms Research Team. John's most recent books include the edited volume, Performing Environmentalisms, Expressive Culture and Ecological Change, also Animal Tales from the Caribbean, and Corrido, the Living Ballad of Mexico's Western Coast, and Inga Rimangapa Samuichi, Speaking the Quechua of Colombia, and Poetry and Violence, the Ballad Tradition of Mexico's Costa Chica. His research is located at the confluence of language and culture, with a focus on speech play and verbal art as expressive resources that are both reflective of and constitutive of society. John, es un placer. I'm so glad you're with us. You're on.
Well, thank you, Norma, and let me commend you for your Quechua pronunciation. Very impressive. Well, hello, everybody, all over the world. It's nice to be here. I'm in Bloomington, Indiana. Yeah, I'm in my first week of being Professor Emeritus. It feels good so far, but I don't fully understand it yet. But anyway, let me get down to business here. So yeah, this title, Others Studying Others as Others, is kind of a provocative title. I like it. Hope it seems like it's provoking us into tossing out there some things that are worth thinking about. It has a kind of philosophical potential in it, as well as a very practical one. And I'd like to touch on both of those just a little bit. My initial thought is that these terms like other, othering, otherness, it's interesting how each of you has each of my panelists who's gone before me has come up with a particular permutation of the terminology. I think Jose was talking about the real or true other. So this is like crossing some kind of a threshold of social distance where it's hardly debatable that you're dealing with somebody who you perceive to be very different. I like Raquel took us into othering as a process, and I think that's interesting. And then Ruth, you just brought up otherness as a kind of a quality, which intrigues me. But what I want to throw in there, sort of in this philosophical moment, is other only acquires its possibility in contrast to something else, which I suppose is self, and that's equally problematic. I think the idea of self doesn't have a whole lot of stability once you start to look carefully at it. Just as I think the idea of the other is pretty elusive and problematic when you start to look into it. And yet these are practical terms. I think that one thing that it would be kind of an interesting exercise would be to think about selfing, for example. If we have othering, what would selfing be? So othering is, in essence, sort of increasing the perception of social distance. So selfing might be decreasing that perception of social distance. And that puts me in mind of something that's happened to me a couple of times in the Andes, where I have baptized a child and become a compadre within a family. This could be thought of as a mechanism for selfing. Well, anyway, I don't want to get too tangled up in the terminology. So those are fun to think about, those ideas. But let me set that aside for the moment. The lure of the other. So now working just comfortably and not questioning our terminology too much is undeniable. And certainly it is something that has, if you wish, afflicted me or enabled me. It certainly has been an important factor in my life as a scholar. This perception of social distance, the effort to understand people that we perceive to be different, really is part ultimately of a quest for maybe bridging our sense of a shared humanity. This is the idealistic formulation of it in a kind of an enlightenment project. But I think that is a motivating factor and very realistic in terms of my own experience as a scholar. I would say that entering the world of the other, in my experience, the only way to do anything worthwhile there is through a process of what I'd like to call radical collaboration. You remember the term radical empiricism. I think maybe I'm sort of building on that a little bit, but radical collaboration. And I feel that any good ethnography that is produced is done through this kind of process, whether or not this process is made explicit. One of the great things about the trend in social science and humanities over recent decades is we are more open and straightforward about the process of constructing knowledge. And so the collaborative ethos that I think imbues all solid ethnography is much more visible now in ethnographic accounts. You all can think back, all my fellow panelists can think back to scholarship that we've read where it's almost as if there's this disembodied ethnographer who leaves no trace, in the community. But of course, anyone who does ethnography knows that that is a fiction. Well, so radical collaboration. I wrote an article some years ago, which I titled Collaborative Ethnopoetics. And really, it was just a kind of an examination of what was the process? How did I go from the spoken word, for example, in the Sibling Valley of Colombia, to words on a page in a book? And when I thought carefully about it, I saw that it was based on really a process that was thoroughly collaborative. I sometimes think of people that came along and helped me and partnered with me in this work as magical helpers. And I've been very fortunate in my work over the years to find people like that. whether it was in the Costa Chica, where I was working with the singers and the composers of corridos, the ballads, or whether it was in the Andes, where I was working with indigenous cultures and indigenous spiritual systems. I always had the good fortune to find people who were within those communities who were also fascinated by their own cultures and often welcomed my presence as an opportunity to pursue those interests. And of course, I ended up in some cases publishing shared joint articles and other kinds of projects with these people. Well, let me move on to just say something. This is an opportunity, as Ruth took advantage of it, and Jose, I guess we're all doing this, kind of an opportunity to for a little retrospective take on our own work. And a feature that I find interesting as I just reflect back over many years of connection to these two communities in Latin America, the ballad community down on the Costa Chica on the western coast of Mexico, and Andean populations, Andean communities in the south of Colombia and the north of Ecuador. An interesting feature that I notice in a kind of progression in my own work over the years is from an initial fascination with the formal properties of discourse. And a lot of my work, as Norma said, has to do with looking at discourse and how discourse enters into the construction of society. But in a lot of that early work, I was really trying to understand the sort of formal properties and how manipulations in the various potentials of language, whether it be in acoustics or in the referential capacity of language, how those kinds of artistic permutations could create powerful statements. But for example, I think back to my work with sayings of the ancestors in the Sibling Valley of Colombia, and in that setting, I was very interested in the kind of spiritual life of this community, but I was really looking at that as something I wanted to understand in itself. Now, moving forward from those earlier works to the work that I'm doing these days, I see a shift really away from this sort of micro-analysis, if you wish, towards a more interpretive palette, I think. And I know this is something that's happened, it's kind of swept through the humanities and social sciences, but when I think about my work in the Andes, for example, I feel that a lot of the impetus for this shift came from the community itself. In other words, I started attending to what these younger generations are doing. I'm now working, often they're the children or even grandchildren of the people I first knew in the Sibling Valley, which is wonderful. In those settings, for example, I've come up with this idea of eco-sovereignty, really based on the kinds of things I'm hearing from the activists in the Sibling Valley, among the Otavaleños in the north of Ecuador. Eco-sovereignty, a kind of a claim to stewardship or curatorship over land that has a kind of millennial connection to the community. And it really is part of an attempt to conserve the culture, the language, and so forth. And it's fascinating because it represents a kind of a point of juncture between traditional resources that are then sort of brought forward and brought into conversation with larger global concerns having to do with biodiversity, having to do with buen vivir, or the idea of living in a spiritually healthy way on the land. So that's a kind of an intriguing feature that I find as I think back to the work that I've done over the years. Well, I think that's probably all I have to throw out here for now, but I look forward to pursuing the conversation. Let's see what happens next.
Muchas gracias, John. What happens next is all of us, well, especially the four of you, can ask each other questions or comment. We do have some questions that I will go to after this. So are there any comments from any of you to each other? Just unmute yourself and speak.
muted.
Well, I will begin with John. Maybe it's the last one I was thinking about when you were talking about the community itself taking on the directing of what kind of research they wanted, and the idea of eco sovereignty. It reminded me of what the recordings by Boaz and Curtis among the Kwakiutl, and how they were instrumental in constructing a community of people and constructing a tradition, memory in future generations. And I thought that that's kind of a reivindication of the work we folklorists and anthropologists do in recording folklore and recording songs and recording myths and tales that could be later used by other generations to kind of recapture something of their traditions that might have been lost. So I thought about that when you were talking about your research.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Raquel. That's interesting. It's a kind of a strange, and this probably happened to everybody on the panel. It's a strange experience when you find that your work has become foundational to the community itself. And it's like, how did that happen? But in a way, it did, because as you say, and this is a very familiar understanding of American anthropology. You mentioned the Boasian school and so forth. But I was in the Sibling Valley, for example, back in the 1970s, and I was able to document, some features of culture that, haven't really persisted. People know about them, but for example, there's a figure, Wangitsmuna, who's a very interesting culture hero in the indigenous community there, the Kamsa people. And now the younger people, they may have heard the name, but anyway, so yeah, it's really interesting. And a number of these young folks are in touch with me nowadays. Everybody gets in touch with everybody, and they value that work because it did document something that's important to them. And that's a great feeling for me to know that maybe inadvertently, but fortuitously, I'm able to make this contribution to the community.
Just curious. Yeah, go ahead, Jose.
Can you hear me now? Let's see.
Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to have react to a little bit to John, because he made me remember back in graduate student days that he and I had some interesting discussions in a place called the Tavern over too many pitchers of beer about precisely this question about the description of formal properties versus a more interpretive framework. I was more on that side of things. John would control my flights of fancy, and meanwhile I would point out to him that it did not all end with formal property descriptions as such. So it's interesting to recall that now at this point of our careers.
Yeah. I just want to say that Jose and I were pals in graduate school, and it's wonderful. Of course, we've stayed connected over the years here and there at conferences and so forth. But I do remember the Tavern very well. I remember some moments of our time together in the Tavern. But that's interesting. I mean, I think I was coming at the material from a maybe more an academic, the training that I had in linguistics and so forth. And as you told us a few minutes ago, you were coming at it as a person within the culture and working within those features of the culture, and it gave us a slightly different take on things.
It also reflected the diversity of intellectual views within the folklore program.
Yeah. Yeah, because we had Americo Paredes there, who was influential in for both of us. But we had people like Roger Abrams over in the English department, and of course Dick Bauman running the folklore program. Joel Schertzer in anthropology. It was a wonderful team of thinkers, really, as you say, offering a lot of different lines of potential inquiry.
that's what we were hoping we would recreate with this kind of Latinidades panel, which brings forth all kinds of different. I'm still intrigued by Ruth's shift, as they say now, pivot to being a creative writer. But yeah, all of the transformations that occur and how we and yes, you're right, John. I think everybody has kind of done a retrospective of the work, the early work, and where you're now, what kind of work you're into now, and what's happening, even maybe for the future. Ruth, do you want to say something? I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I have a question for Raquel. Raquel, I was so fascinated by your work on espiritistas and brujas in Puerto Rico. And, and in my work in Translated Woman, I was working with a woman, Esperanza, who was thought to be a bruja in this town in Mexico. And so I was wondering about the role of women in your work and, and any feminist approaches you might have to how you're thinking about brujas and espiritistas, and in the community, also in the Latina Chicana community, it's often thought also to be a source of pride to say soy una bruja, with all the different significances that could have. So I was wondering if you might want to talk more about that, because I thought it was so fascinating, and how it might relate or not relate to otherness.
Well, thank you for your question. Yes, actually, the whole gender discussion arose after I finished my research. Even though I had here and there all sorts of elements that I could construct a gender kind of argument. Nowadays, actually, I'm jumping to the present. I was contacted by current brujas, young brujas, who read my stuff and who were inspired by this kind of non-judgmental commodification, social media kind of thing. And they see what they do as a form of activism. And they also say proudly, we are brujas. And they are all over the country, and they communicate and they encourage and they empower women through this kind of work, which actually brings me back to Aide and to other women that are espiritistas, brujas, who usually do other kinds of work, and but also work in their homes. This is a very this kind of work is good to do at home, as many mothers can relate to that you don't have to go out to do your work. And so they created this kind of circles of empowerment among women and among men because of their spiritual power, their gifts, their spiritual gifts. And I think that, yes, there's a lot of similarities and parallels with all Latin America, all over Latin America and Caribbean, the Spanish Caribbean, of course, with Cuba, of course. There's a lot of interchange and influence, one or the other. And I think this is, this is a powerful position for a woman to be. Although I have also to mention that I always talked about the pruebas, the tests, and the tragedies that usually follow women who engage in this kind of spiritual work. And most of them lose their husbands on the way. And have all sorts of other, problems with lovers and whatever. But in terms of family relationships, it's kind of a strain on them, for sure. So,
There's
yeah.
lots of chat and questions. I think I'll switch over there now. And for Ruth, what do you mean by fluid identity from Iveta? And Sophia then says, I was thinking of Ipsy identity and identity and the possibilities of narrative identity. Could you comment on that?
Wow, that's probably a little too profound for me to respond to, but that's really good. But I'll try. Yeah, I mean, I think fluid identities. I think we have a different sense of identity now than we did 20 or 30 years ago. I think we were still tending to put people in boxes a little bit more, and communities in boxes. And I think we're a little bit more aware now of, I mean, the key term these days is intersectionality. And I think, the intersection of different cultures, I think, is very important, different communities, different ways of thinking about identity. And I think in the past, we tended to think of communities as kind of, I don't know, like each of them like living in its own vacuum, which can happen because a lot of communities, of course, are very segregated. But in the end, even the most segregated communities do connect with other communities as well. And I always say this, having grown up in New York. I mean, I grew up very much within this Cuban community. People, friends of my parents who'd known each other, since Cuba, and then they reconnected when they resettled in New York. And I was always in that community, but I was also connecting to many other immigrant communities that were all around me. And so I think you develop a fluid identity no matter what, in that sense, because you're always in contact with various other kinds of communities, and our histories are much more mixed, I think, than many of us sometimes are willing to recognize. So I think that's what I mean when I say, that identity is fluid. Also, identity can change over time, as well as you connect with different communities, as you think about yourself in different ways at different points in time. So there's also that fluidity, as well, that I think is part of it. And particularly the work that I did on the portable island, thinking of Cubans as people that are all over the world. I mean, that was definitely research that led me to think about the fluidity of identity. Like, Cubans would thought of themselves in a certain way when they lived in Cuba, then when they moved to Russia, to Germany, or, to any number of different places, Chile, their identities then became hyphenated in various kinds of ways. And so that fluidity can also happen over time. It wasn't something they were expecting when they were still living in Cuba. And I know many people that I met in Cuba who eventually immigrated from Cuba and became hyphenated. Their identities became hyphenated in various kinds of ways that were unexpected. So I think there's also the temporal aspect of identity, and how identity can also shift over time.
Claudia has a kind of not really follow-up question, but also for you, about how easy or difficult it has been for you to navigate between academic and creative writing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's interesting to note that I didn't try writing a novel till I was almost 60 years old. So I think that says something about, just maybe how concerned I felt about trying to break out of my anthropological identity and seek the literary identity, which was something I'd always wanted, but wasn't sure I could pursue, or wasn't sure that I had the skills to do it. So it was something I kept putting off, and I would write poetry and maybe stories, personal essays, but actually writing fiction was very challenging for me. It was something I really wanted to do, but the idea that I could give myself permission to create characters, to put any words in their mouths that I wanted to, that was difficult and shocking for me, because I was used to doing ethnographic work and interviewing people and taking notes and never changing anything they said, being, really careful. Though I struggled with that in Translated Woman, because there I had done this, this long project of interviewing one woman, but then, when I had to put the story together, I couldn't possibly include every single word she had said to me. I had to edit, and I had to shape the narrative, and that raised a lot of issues for me about writing, and was I doing fiction, or what was I doing in that project? So I'd started thinking about that a long time ago, but it's quite different to be concerned about working with an actual document and how you're going to represent it than actually creating the documents yourself, which is what I was doing in fiction. So I would say it took me a long time to be able to sort of come out of my anthropology shell and move into my creative, fiction writing, poetry writing shell. But it was something that I really wanted kind of my whole life. And I guess, as I was getting close to 60, I thought, well, it's sort of now or never. But what surprised me was that the voice came out in the voice of a child. That's what I wasn't expecting. I thought I was just going to be writing fiction, but it was this 10-year-old girl that was sort of me, but wasn't me, because it's been a long time since I was 10. So I had to, put myself in the space of a 10-year-old girl's voice. So I think now, at least like my colleagues at Michigan seem to be very, very kind about the fact that I'm like doing these two things. And some of my colleagues have said, "Oh yeah, I got your book for my daughter." I mean, so that's been like really sweet. Like they've been kind about it. They haven't said, "Okay, you can't be an anthropologist anymore. You're writing fiction." It's more like, "All right, great, you're doing this thing," and I still
Yeah.
view myself as doing both. That I still think of myself as an anthropologist and now as a fiction writer as well.
Yeah, someone on the chat also said that they got your novel for a granddaughter. So, yeah, definitely. And also appreciating the kind of work you're doing. There's a question for Jose. Could you please explain what it means that the Laredo son became yours? What else had changed?
What else? Well, everything changed. That's why the Laredo song became mine. uh, Including, and we're going back to the question of self and other that John raised so well. And that is, one self changes over time. You become more comfortable with what previously used to be otherness. And to answer that question, I become very attached to the song. What can I say? you know, and in some ways, the attachment to the song began to drive the research and the writing about it. I just like the song. The fact that it mentions Laredo is, in some ways, neither here nor there. It's the narrative of the song and what Americo Paredes would have called its emotional core that began to appeal to me. Now, therein lies another story which has to remain unanswered unless I get myself a therapist. That is, why would it appeal, that particular emotional core, to someone like myself at this point in my life, to then make me turn 360 degrees around to not work with directly, of course, but historically with Texas Anglo white cowboys who in a previous generation would have been so significantly other as to want to kill ourselves.
Mhm. Yeah, maybe it is time for a therapist. And no, but I share some of
I
those
have my chihuahua,
concerns.
so we're okay.
That'll work. But I do share some of those concerns. Also, I was looking at one of the questions says, does our focus on folklore contribute to a distinctive kind of othering or selfing, enabled by the kinds of structures of communication to which we must lend ourselves, and how? That's a big one. Anyone want to have a stab at it?
I don't do those very well, so I'll leave it to my colleagues.
Um, I don't know, Norma, if I may just kind of return a little bit to to what José Limón mentioned before, because I was reflecting, and it takes me time to reflect and then kind of come up with a kind of narrative or a question or a comment. It reminded me, I don't know if you can relate to that, but cultural ownership is kind of something that is, I think, at sometimes at temporal and translocal. It reminded me of a panel that Amy Schumann organized at the AFS about cultural ownership, which drove me to think about ownership, let's say in my case of spirits, who owns the spirits? Because there was a contention of whose spirits are they, and I think that cultural ownership and claims to ownership is what sometimes make us become part of an us, of a community against, kind of an othering which claims that it's not legitimate for us to claim that kind of piece of culture. So I thought about you, Jose, that it's actually a way of reclaiming something of that kind of cultural ownership of Laredo, of your Laredo. And I think that it's a welcome thing. I don't think that you need a psychoanalyst for that, but rather to write, kind of carry that, um, recognize that kind of biographical um, ownership that you have with the place and with the time, probably before the Anglo took over Laredo.
Although, as I think I mentioned in the talk, one of the ironies of this is that I'm quite convinced that the song never took place in Laredo in any form or fashion. Whoever composed it, I think, just simply loved, which is another subject altogether, which is to say the pronunciation of Spanish language names in English and the aspirated syllabic way that it sounds, Laredo or El Paso or Los Angeles or Amarillo, as opposed to Amarillo, El Paso, Laredo, which have a slightly rougher sound, ironically enough, in Spanish. And I think some cowboy just liked the name Laredo. It just sounds good on the Anglo tongue.
John, I have a comment from Norma Alarcón.
Oh, yeah.
Who says, remember our bar in KKK land?
Oh, my goodness.
That's her comment. And then there's a question from Peggy Bulgarian says, could someone discuss the dilemma of doing ethnography with individuals who are much more complex than being a representative of a particular other culture? We are all individually diverse, and this poses interesting challenges. It's for someone, whoever wants to discuss that.
Well, before we go to that one, I did want to just say something about the previous question, which I think was really important. But before that, I want to ask Jose if your fascination with this carries over to Marty Robbins and the West Texas town of El Paso.
Well, as a matter of fact, I wrote about that in my book, American Encounters. Yes.
It does. It does. So this goes deeper than we thought. Well,
like I said, maybe it's therapy time. I don't know.
The question about why folklore, puts me in mind of the role of folklore in the nation building processes, all across Europe and in other parts of the world, more recently in other parts of the world. But the Finnish example is classic, the Kalevala. And yeah, there's something about folklore, the fact that it captures something communal about a population, the fact that it is homegrown, at least can be represented as something that emerges from the people. But folklore is central. Expressive culture is in the middle of, I think, all of these larger political processes. So yeah, there's some qualities about the stuff that we study that are very special and that lend these materials a very important role, I think, in the formation of society and culture.
The structures of communication, which is what that question kind of was getting at. Yeah, and what about discussing the dilemma of doing ethnography with those who are from much more complex than just representatives of an other culture? Anyone?
I can try to respond to that a little bit, as someone who's always been interested in subjectivity, both that of the ethnographer and of those being ethnographized. And I think it's a complex question. It's kind of been an issue, I feel, in ethnographic work and folklore work, perhaps from the beginning, because we're expected and we kind of have signed up to study communities and collectivities and groups, right? And so then if that's our mission, can we then study individuals and the complexities of individual people? And individual journeys might be very different, and people might connect with a particular culture in one way and then with another culture in a different way. So for me, it was kind of a struggle, I think, always. As an anthropologist, I think it's what led me, at least, in one of my projects, to write about just one person, writing Translated Woman. It's like I chose one person because I did exactly as this person is asking in the question. I got the sense that she was so complex, that she wasn't just, a Mexican woman from a town in San Luis Potosi. There was a lot more going on there, including the fact that she was seen as a bruja. And I mean, there were so many different layers to her story. And even though I had, gone to Mesquitique with the plan of writing about a group of women and I was interviewing different women in the town, I basically set aside those plans and just decided to write about Esperanza Hernandez and just focus on her, because indeed that was what I felt, that she was so complex. She had so much to say about so many different things, about spirituality, about gender identity, about being a mother. I mean, so much that I just gave, all of my attention to her. But I know that also we can't do that always as ethnographers and folklorists, because we do come back to to communities in the end. But so I think it's a conundrum, and I think each of us finds different ways to solve it. I know, like with José's work, I mean, José, you've always included a lot of analysis of subjectivity, certainly in your in your book, Dancing with the Devil and so on. I mean, there's a real understanding of the individuals involved in the story and how they each are intersecting in being part of the ethnographic story that you're telling. So I think there's also ways to bring in that understanding of subjectivity as we also look at communities by, I think, really listening to what people say, incorporating their words into what we're writing. So there's many ways, I think, to do that as writers, to be respectful of all the different voices that we get to hear in our field work.
Hey, there's a comment and a question. First, thanks to all, but my question or comment is for John. You wondered whether the opposite of othering might be selfing. That implies one seeing oneself as an individual, but often one's identity is tied up with one's group or groups. In that way, one is not alone, but is a part of a larger collective. I am reminded of esoteric versus and exoteric. Is selfing too narrow, too exclusive?
I think I might flip a coin on that one.
Could be either one.
No, it's another conundrum, isn't it? I think that it's the same conundrum really that Ruth just spoke to, where at one level of analysis, every individual is unique, and even situations call for a particular presentation of self, and a different situation would call for a different self to be accessed, I suppose. At the same time, there's no question that we can see commonalities across individuals. So I think this might be taking the easy way out, but I think I'm going to piggyback on Ruth's idea here, and that is, we each have to figure this out and find a way that when we write up our studies of people and their cultures, in the end, feeling that we've done justice. There's some compromises. I think everybody on the panel will probably, or maybe it's just me, but there's always in my work, there's a sense that I had to let go of something in order to come up with something, and maybe that's the name of the game.
Yeah, there's a kind of not follow-up question, but also for you. How do you see your work in Colombia vis-a-vis, quote, informants, their place in the current lethal protests at this time?
Yeah. So Colombia, in case you don't know, is going through a very traumatic moment. It's no more than a moment. It's been going on for months now. It's not unfamiliar based on what happened after the George Floyd murder and the police repression of protests. But it's maybe just, it's at a different level of viciousness, I suppose, in Colombia. It's very complicated. For example, the Sibling Valley, which I mentioned earlier, down in the southwestern corner of the country. This is an area where the paramilitaries came through there, the FARC would come through there, and the indigenous people got swept up in something that was really not of their own making, but because they were on the periphery, they were just beyond the sort of zone of government authority. They experienced these waves of of successive violence. And a sad detail here is one of my best friends there, the family that I was essentially adopted into in the Sibling Valley, they called me Joaquin Mayor, which means oldest son. So this is another selfing process, right? But the Juan, my friend from those days, is among the disappeared, and but now we have another convulsion. Um, what can the folklorists do? In some ways, at moments like this, I feel very small, but still, maybe there are ways, with our particular expertise and our connections that we can be there for the people that we care about.
Yeah, that one was also from Norma Larcon. Now we have a comment and a question from Guillermo de los Reyes.
Hi, Norma.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you all for sharing your insightful ideas and your perspective on otherness. My question is regarding our position of privilege as scholars. How do we as scholars, folk practitioners, position ourselves to discuss the other? Anyone? On some level, I think, Ruth, you have already addressed this because you were talking about how when you first started doing the work, you didn't realize how complex a person, the I don't want to call her your informant, but the person you were working with, your collaborator, was. And so I think sometimes because we come from that position of power that we can cross that border at will, it is a privilege, a position of privilege. We have to acknowledge that. But that, Guillermo, that's just my reaction to your question. Um, and as a practitioner, I always go back to my work with the Matachines. Invariably, they will call me Miss Cantu. They never call me Norma. And I've insisted, even the older people, they always say Miss Cantu until I stopped trying to change that after 20 years or so, because I realized that for them, it is a demarcation. It is giving me that place of position, the privilege, the power, which I have. I'm not in that community. I don't live right by the river. I don't have the experiences they have. And so it was kind of a way of telling me that there is this difference. And so maybe that answers your question. I don't know, Guillermo. We can discuss that at AFS at some point. Betty Belenas has a question. So interesting. You're all coming from so many interpretations of the other. My question is, in collaboration with communities, have any of you ever had community member or members express that their interpretations of themselves are quite different from yours as a researcher slash writer, and you got it wrong? Raquel, you're laughing.
Nice, yes. Well, the truth is also it ties into the previous question is that I actually felt many times that I was fulfilling a role that was prescribed for me. Aide knew that I was coming, and she saw the book that I was writing about her even before I started doing field work. So I was kind of actually fulfilling her image of what my role would be with her. um, right at the beginning, when I really hesitantly came to her house and she was sick and in bed, and I started kind of mumbling, yes, can I, come and work with you? And she said, okay, listen, on Monday you come and we start working from 8 till I finish. So she had like your Miss Norma kind of thing. She had an idea of who was I, what she wanted me to be. I just needed to fulfill that role for her. And no matter what I explained to her, I became her reportera, right? In Spanish, reportera is the reporter. And no matter what I explained to her, and why reportera, at that time there were many magazines and newspapers that had like editorials about famous brujos and santeros working, in Puerto Rico. So every week, every, Sunday newspaper would feature someone like that. So she saw herself already there, you're my reportera, and that's it. This is the role that I was assigned to. I just needed to perform it accordingly. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I might
Please.
add something to this. It might be interesting. You know, I've also written about my family, and in terms of getting it wrong, several of my members of my family have been very upset with things I've written about the family. I write about this briefly in my book Traveling Heavy in one of the essays, but I did write an article that was about the family, particularly about my relationship with my maternal grandmother. And it got a lot of people really angry in my family. So I have found that my family gets more upset about my writing than the people that I've worked with ethnographically. And there's an interesting book on this topic edited by Joy Castro, who's a literary critic and fiction writer, also a macondista, and it's called Family Trouble. And it's precisely about this topic, writers who've families and the flack that they've gotten, how upset family members have been by how they've been represented in the work. So that's interesting to think about.
Yeah, it is. We have somebody from Mexico says, thanks so much for organizing this panel. So important for new and younger generations to hear the varied voices of experience and crossings and darings to cross those disciplinary they moved it, borders imposed by academia and sometimes even ourselves. In this slide, what would you all say about the challenges in anthropology and folklore studies for and of the 21st century?
I,
Go ahead, Jose.
I'm going to be very unkind here and say that since John just most recently retired, he should answer that question. Or he should take it on from the folklore program.
Thanks, Jose. You always were a considerate fellow. I remember now better. Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like I can predict the future very well. I will say this, that I'm very encouraged by the important role that Latinos, whatever the terminology you're going to select here, Latinxes, um, you know what I'm talking about, that these folks are playing in the American Folklore Society. I mean, I feel like there are a lot of sources of vitality in the American Folklore Society today, but this is one of them, right? The mostly younger group of scholars who are now situated in teaching positions around the country, but very active in folklore studies and bringing a different perspective. I think asking questions of the field. And that's the best thing that can happen. I have a little slogan: keep folklore feisty. You know, Jose and I, when we were doing our thing down there in Austin, we came to folklore. Well, I'll speak for myself. I came to folklore because it was feisty. It was subversive in some ways. It was a kind of an outlier in the academic world. So people lament that, but I celebrate it, I think. It has some negative consequences, okay. But I think that maybe we can see in the kinds of questions that these young folks are asking of us. And what are the questions? Well, they're really asking, how is our research being done? Who is it serving? Are there ways we can rethink basic terminology in our field, to encompass the the experience of marginalized populations and so forth. Honestly, that's the promise I see right now, is young people making us feel uncomfortable. That's what we did to our elders, and by God, I want them to do it to us.
And I think that's true. It bodes well for the 21st century when all that is happening. Um, Anyone else? Raquel, Ruth?
When actually it's a little bit a side question. When I was thinking about the topic for this webinar, I was thinking about how would the other appear now in an era where postcoloniality is not such a vibrant maybe concept to work with, and what kind of otherings or others are kind of emerging not out of the post-colonial context. And I was thinking about all the, gender and trans and all the others that are within ourselves. And I was just wondering what the new generation of folklorists would be contending with as they go out and do fieldwork and look at expressive culture.
Margarita has got a comment and a question for John. A great big thank you to all the wonderful speakers. Special hello to John from a fellow Andinista. In the Andes, there are many stories about otherness, like the Pishtaco stories of Bolivia and Peru. One view is that these may be disguised forms of parts of the self identity or heritage, that may be denied by the community and are thus considered other. Any thoughts about this in relation to your own work?
That's really interesting. Well, um, I think so. In the Andes, as in other parts of the world, there is um, the concept of the monstrous, and there are all kinds of monstrous figures. Uh, the Chificha, some of the witch-like figures in Ecuador, and on up into the areas where I work. And the Bishtaco is interesting. So I don't know. I think the idea of self and other is really interesting there. There's no question that the monsters that we imagine are reflections of ourselves in some sense, right? I mean, um, uh, that's why monsters differ from one culture to another, even if we do see commonalities. The Pistaco is so interesting, the Karisiri down in Bolivia, for example, because what this is a stranger who comes sort of on the periphery of a community and is ultimately going to suck the fat out of people, and the people will wither away. I know for the Weight Watchers in our country, that might be a kind of an appealing idea, but it's not in the Andes. The fat is the vital source of life in the Andes. But among those who can be identified as Pistacos are priests who come in from the city to the more rural areas, and anthropologists and folklorists who
Wow.
appear asking questions and um, whose motives are not entirely clear. So yeah, so that's an interesting
Yeah.
line of inquiry as well.
Yeah, so we have a comment. It's a rather long one, but I'll read it because it's about Raquel. This is more of a comment than a question. Raquel Romberg's amazing talk on her research reminded me of Rodolfo Anaya's Bless Me Ultima. Maybe this is a great example of how a bruja, espiritista, who is initially otherized, manages to create or activate dialogic interactions into the protagonist's developing consciousness and eventually contributes to the creation of new hybrid cultural forms. Thank you so much, Raquel. And
Okay,
then
thank you.
Carol Brooks says, can anyone share their thoughts on the othering that takes place between culture bearing from one generation to the next? The younger generations are claiming their personal identities from a multitude of cultural and familial traditions alongside social context of identity and belonging to the communities they choose. As I am maturing, I am grappling with understanding my personal identities and family cultures/traditions versus the requirement of me constantly evolving to understanding the fluidity of cultural norms of a younger generation. Anyone?
Mm.
No? Carol, I think that's going to remain a question. It's a little deep, I think, to kind of ask us to think on our toes, kind of to come up with, because these are thoughts about othering and about the future and the future generations from
Well,
one generation to the next. John,
May I
yeah,
did you
ask
want
a
to?
question now? Something that I was thinking about, asking Ruth about her maternal grandmother. I can very much identify with your personal story. since my family also, they tried to escape Europe, but they didn't. So I'm kind of envious of your grandmother, maternal grandmother, that she did move. Can you tell us a little bit more about the context of that move? Because at that time, that was a major, major decision to make, especially for a woman. And I don't know what were the possibilities. Were there ships that were leaving for Cuba or that were recruiting people? What was, do you know something about the context of that kind of movement? Especially since today we have other kind of transnational, migration that also have to take great risks to save their families, their lives, and to look for other, more viable ways of life. So I think it could be really relevant to other situations nowadays as well.
Thank you for that, Raquel. I'll be very brief because it's kind of a long story, but at that time in the 20s and 30s, many Jewish people were able to find a refuge in Cuba. They were trying to come to the United States, but actually the door to the United States had closed. There was an Immigration Act passed in 1924. It was also the time when the border was established between the US and Mexico, so both of these things came together. Historically, they had a quota system in the US that limited the number of Eastern European and Southern European immigrants to the US, and many were coming from Poland in particular, wanted to come from Poland to the US, and they couldn't. But Cuba was opening its doors in this period for very racialized reasons. They were concerned, the elite in power in Cuba were concerned that Cuba was becoming too black, right? And that the Black Cubans were becoming too strong after the independence struggle at the end of the 19th century, because Black Cubans also fought for the independence of Cuba and thought that they would then become true citizens of Cuba, and then discovered that they weren't. But that population was growing and the white elite was very concerned. And so they opened their doors to European immigrants, and there were actually many Spaniards that immigrated to Cuba, in the early 20th century after the Spanish-American War, because Cuba at that time was a more developed country than Spain because of the US influence on Cuba, which had started in the 19th century. And so anyway, so many Jews found their way to Cuba in this period. It was advertised in the Yiddish press, actually, at the time in Europe, that if you could get to Cuba, it was so close to the United States that you could practically swim over. And so people thought, okay, I'll get to Cuba and then I'll find a visa, I'll get a visa to go to the United States. And so many used Cuba as a kind of trampoline to then come to the United States, but then many others just came to love Cuba as a place and felt they had found their America in Cuba. And so when my grandmother went, actually her father, my great grandfather, had been in Cuba for 3 years. And he had had a lot of trouble saving enough money to bring the family to Cuba, and conditions were getting worse and worse in Poland. But after 3 years, he made enough money to bring one of his children. And that was when my grandmother insisted that she be the one, and she was going to help him bring everybody. But in fact, she didn't bring anybody. And we also lost a lot of family in Europe in the Holocaust, because her own grandmother, who she wanted to bring to Cuba, did not want to go to Cuba because she loved Poland and didn't want to leave her home in Poland. And she stayed behind, and other family also stayed behind in Poland and died in the war. So they didn't all make it across, but many did, and came to view Cuba with tremendous gratitude, which is how I view Cuba. I view Cuba as the place that saved the life of my family and eventually made it possible for descendants like me to exist. So my connection to Cuba is very powerful from that perspective, because they couldn't make it into the United States at that time. And Cuba became the sanctuary. So I was thinking about all these things. And as you said, especially young people who've often sacrificed their lives to try to bring their families to a place of refuge. And, of course, we see that on the US-Mexico border with so many kids that come on their own to try to help their families or connect with their families here. And I was thinking about all of that. And then I said, wait a minute, this is very similar to my grandmother's story, but in a different era and migrating to a different place. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Thank you.
Ruth. We have a question from Leah Busby. She says, "Hi, I'm a folklore MA student at Berkeley, just beginning my thesis research. Can you talk about the importance of looking at our own histories, speaking of, as researchers, before we embark on understanding others?" The question is for anyone, possible Ruth, Jose, good comment. Thank you. Either one of you, Jose or Ruth.
Could you restate the question again? I
Sure.
think
She says she's an MA student at Berkeley beginning thesis research. Can you talk about the importance of looking at our own histories as researchers before we embark on understanding others?
I think I would just quarrel with the word before. Maybe the better preposition would be as you begin. You might want to consider your own histories. I mean, obviously, I've tried to do that in my work. On the other hand, I'm always thinking, and I think we would agree that our real work is to say something about other people, not about ourselves necessarily. Now, obviously, the two get implicated, the self and the other, as we said earlier. But nevertheless, I would just, be a little cautious about that. About that you have to go through it, that entire self-searching process before you can begin to do some interesting work. I don't think so.
Okay. Ruth, any comments?
I might disagree with that, Jose, because I think actually having that bit of soul searching or that understanding of your own community and culture and identity, I think that does give you a certain kind of depth of identity that then might prepare you to look for that sort of depth of identity in others as well. So I actually think that the two do go together, and I think to be able to represent people in a complex way,
Well,
I think it's helpful to have thought about one's own identity or identity of one's community in a complex way, which I think you do. I mean, Jose, you talked about, actually I was going to ask you to say more about it, about fissured otherness when you were talking about how you wrote about Bork and Dobie. And so I think that fissured otherness might be a very helpful concept that I think all of us can relate to that when we think of our own identities and communities. And then if we bring that to understanding of others as well, I think we might achieve more depth in our representations.
Well, like I said, I don't rule out the process of self-examination. I just think that, perhaps it might even be better to conduct such a self-examination as one is already underway in work, rather than in some isolated moment in some cubicle in some university, or in one's apartment or whatever. I'm not quite sure I understand the application of the fissured identity part, but I do think obviously that at this point, perhaps for a long time now, all of our identities are fissured in some way. And what I was trying to say is someday I was trying to look at those particular folklores, but I think, if we accept that notion that there are fissures and contradictions within ourselves, then certainly those bear self-examination as well.
And for someone just starting out on a master's thesis, I think it might be good to look at oneself, but not necessarily before starting to do the work. Because at least for me, what happens is in the process of doing the work, the revelations come about the self and about identities and all the others. And actually, I have a question for myself. This is from Sophia. A question, reading and also teaching Canicula, thinking also of creative autobioethnography. I was wondering how it feels to do ethnography and to be ethnographized concurrently. I'm not sure I know how to answer that. I'll have to take off my moderator hat and put on the one as, I don't know, writer who does ethnography and who does creative autobioethnography. It's a difficult one because I don't think about it while I'm writing. I just do it. Later, and especially critics are the ones who look at that and say that's what I'm doing. But I really just immerse myself in it. The second book that follows Canicula, Cabañuelas, is probably a little more conscious of that process and aware, because it is doing ethnography in Spain during the fiestas, but at the same time, the nena, the protagonist, is being what did she say? Ethnographized. So the ethnography is on the self. You're self ethnographizing. So you can tell it's coming to the end. We have about 7 minutes left, and I don't think I have any more questions. I have some comments. Alex Chavez has a long comment about doing work on the Nelson Algren papers, Jose. And
Mhm.
so because of your comment, he's talking about that. There's also a very long comment about, he says, or the person says it's been answered in conversation. Um, Appreciate all of your reflections, that there is careful consideration of the fact that none of us own or have a right to impose our personal assumptions of identity or belonging on those who are subject to our inquiries. I think that's a good way kind of summing up that all of us agree with that we respect the people we work with and work with them. And perhaps the only thing we can ascribe to ourselves and quote others is our shared, and I can't see the rest of the comment. Oh, yes, our shared humanity. I really enjoyed this panel. Thank you all so much. There's been lots of comments like that I haven't been curating for you because there are no questions, just comments of appreciation. So in the last 5 minutes that we have, if each one of you would take maybe a minute or so to just say a few words, and we'll start in the same order, Jose.
Okay. Well, again, I want to thank everyone, and one of the better parts of, not that the discussions were wonderful, but it's just nice to see you all. It's been a while. So thank you, Norma, Amy, Jessica, for Mary, for bringing us together.
Ruth? Oh no, was it Raquel? No, it was Ruth.
To unmute.
Raquel.
Okay, I was muted. Yeah, well, for me, it's a great pleasure. I haven't been to an AFS for many years, and for me, this is a great opportunity. I have to confess that I was very kind of nervous about this format of webinar and whatever. Not seeing people, personally, but I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed listening to your presentations and reconnecting with all people that I haven't seen for a while. So thank you so much for inviting and for organizing this wonderful opportunity.
Ruth?
Yeah, I just want to add my thank you as well. I feel really grateful that I could be here today. It was really nice to be in conversation with all of you. Thank you, Norma, for moderating so beautifully. Thank you to everybody who was with us today. It was really nice to be with all of you. And I really appreciated this conversation. It taught me a lot, and I'll be thinking a lot about the various issues that came up. So really wonderful. And thank you.
John?
Yes, well, as with everybody, I'm just full of thanks. Very enjoyable and stimulating conversation. And in some ways, I think the word identity is just sort of surfacing or floating as a kind of an umbrella for what the hermeneutics of identity. I feel like that's maybe kind of what we're doing here. But anyway, that's working for me at the moment. Lots of good things to continue thinking about.
Thank you. I do want to remind everyone who's here and those of you who watch this after, because some people registered so that they could watch it as a recording. So remind you that we have salons coming. The salons for the webinars work it this way. You register and then you're placed in different spots with a smaller group so that we can have a more in-depth conversation about the topic. Some of the participants will be in those salons. I know Raquel is, and John, and we will also have other folklorists who have volunteered their time to also join us in hosting the salons. And from you can see it on the chat. There's where you can go in and register And you will be getting from AFS a message of how to link in and how to connect on that day. I think it's June 11th. And so we're looking forward to having a more in-depth conversation about the topic of others researching others as others. I know it's a mouthful, but really, muchísimas gracias to all of you. I do want to acknowledge the team from the AFS Fellows, Amy Schumann, Mary Hufford, Robert Barron, who are the executive committee, who are leading our fellows this year and have been doing just a wonderful, wonderful job of creating these webinars. We will also be putting out a call for topics for more webinars for next year. We hope to make this a regular feature, not just for AFS members, but for anyone in the world who would like to join the conversation. Again, thank you very much. And also to TJ and to Ben, our tech assistants who are here. I see TJ, I don't see Ben on here. Yeah, he's here. He's the graduate assistant. Thank you so much for the technical assistance and for getting us all here together this afternoon in my time zone, whatever time it is where you are at. Muchísimas gracias to all of you, to all of our ancestors for allowing us and giving us permission to be who we are. Gracias.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
We did it.